John Lennon gets kicked out of recording session. What he does next shocks everyone. It was February 3rd, 1971, at Abbey Road Studios in London. The air inside Studio 2 was thick with tension, cigarette smoke, and the kind of silence that screams louder than any argument. John Lennon sat slouched in a wooden chair, his round glasses reflecting the dim studio lights, a half-empty bottle of whiskey resting between his feet. The session was supposed to be magical, a collaboration between legends. But magic doesn't happen when egos collide like freight trains in the dark. "You're out of tune, John," said the producer, his voice sharp as broken glass. Again, John didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at the man like he was looking through him into some void only he could see. "Maybe the song's out of tune," John muttered, his Liverpool accent thick with exhaustion and something darker. "Ever think of that?" The room froze. Engineers exchanged glances. Session musicians pretended to adjust their instruments. Everyone knew what was coming. You could feel it in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. "Get out." 2 words. Cold. Final. John looked up slowly, a bitter smile curling at the corner of his lips. "What did you say?" "I said, get out. You're done here. This session is over for you." For a moment, nobody breathed. John Lennon, the man who'd helped change music forever, the voice of a generation, was being thrown out of a recording session like some amateur who couldn't hold a note. He stood up, swaying slightly, grabbed his leather jacket from the back of the chair, and walked toward the door. But before he left, he turned back one last time. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, "not because of who I am, but because of what I'm about to do." The door slammed shut, and in that moment, nobody in that studio knew they'd just witnessed the beginning of something that would shake the entire music industry to its core. John stepped out into the freezing London night, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. Abbey Road was empty, silent. The streetlights cast long shadows that seemed to follow him as he walked. Hands shoved deep into his pockets, mind racing. He'd been kicked out before, thrown out of clubs, banned from venues, told he was too controversial, too dangerous, too much. But this felt different. This felt personal. He walked without direction, letting his feet carry him through the winding streets of St. John's Wood, past the zebra crossing where he and the lads had once posed for a photograph that would become iconic, past the cafes where they'd laughed and dreamed and believed they could conquer the world. Now he was alone, and the world felt colder than it ever had. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. John found himself outside a small rundown pub in Camden, the kind of place where nobody cared who you were or what you'd done. Just another lost soul looking for warmth in a cold world. He pushed open the door. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of cheap beer. A handful of people scattered around worn tables, nursing drinks and regrets. In the corner, an old upright piano sat covered in dust and cigarette burns. John ordered a whiskey, neat. Then another, and another. The bartender, a grizzled man in his 60s with tired eyes, leaned against the bar. "Rough night?" John laughed bitterly. "You could say that. Want to talk about it?" "Not particularly." The bartender nodded, understanding the language of broken men. "Piano's free if you want it. Nobody's played that thing in months." John looked over at the piano. Something stirred inside him. Something he thought had died in that studio an hour ago. He stood up, walked over to the piano, and sat down. His fingers hovered over the keys. Hesitant, uncertain. Then he began to play. The melody that came from John's fingers was unlike anything he'd ever written. It was raw, broken, beautiful in its pain. The kind of music that doesn't come from the head, but from somewhere deeper, darker, more honest. The few people in the pub stopped their conversations, turned to look. Something about the music demanded attention, commanded silence. John began to sing, his voice cracked and vulnerable. They threw me out into the cold, said my fire had grown too old. But they don't know what burns inside, the parts of me I've learned to hide. The words poured out of him like blood from a wound. Every rejection, every loss, every moment of doubt and fear and rage. It all came flooding out in that song, in that moment, in that forgotten pub where nobody knew his name. When he finished, the silence was deafening. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. Slowly. Then another person joined. Then another. Until the entire pub was applauding. Not for John Lennon the legend, but for the broken man who just bared his soul. An old woman with silver hair and kind eyes approached him. "That was beautiful, son. What's it called?" John looked at her, tears threatening to spill from behind his glasses. "I don't know yet. I just needed to get it out." "Well, whatever you call it, don't let it die in here. The world needs to hear that." John nodded, something shifting inside him, a spark, a purpose, a reason to keep going. He left the pub that night with something he didn't have when he walked in: hope. The next morning, John woke up in his flat with a pounding headache and a crystal-clear vision. He knew exactly what he needed to do, and it was going to be insane. He called his friend Klaus Vormann, the German artist and musician who'd always believed in him, even when others didn't. "Klaus, I need your help." "John, it's 7 in the morning. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. I'm going to record an album, but not in a studio, not with producers and engineers and people telling me what to do. I'm going to record it live, in pubs, in streets, in places where real people are." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "John, have you been drinking?" "I'm completely sober, for the first time in months. I'm completely sober and completely sure. Will you help me?" Another pause. Then, "When do we start?" Over the next week, John assembled a small crew. Klaus on bass, Jim Keltner on drums, a sound engineer named Eddie who'd been fired from 3 major studios for being too experimental, and a borrowed recording truck that had seen better days. Their plan was simple but revolutionary. They would travel around London, setting up in different locations each night, and record John performing new songs he'd written in the aftermath of being kicked out. No second takes, no overdubs, just raw, honest, real music. The music industry thought he'd lost his mind. His former bandmates thought he was having a breakdown. The press called it Lennon's folly. But John didn't care. He'd spent too many years caring what other people thought. This was for him, and for everyone who'd ever been told they weren't good enough. It was February 28, 1971. John and his makeshift crew had set up outside the Marquee Club in Soho. Word had spread through London's underground music scene that something unusual was happening, that John Lennon was performing in the streets. By the time the sun set, over 300 people had gathered. Students, artists, factory workers, nurses, finishing their shifts, people from every corner of London, drawn by curiosity and the promise of something real. John stood on a small platform, his guitar slung over his shoulder, looking out at the crowd. No stage lights, no fancy equipment, just him and his music and the people who'd come to hear it. "I was kicked out of a recording session a few weeks ago," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying through the cold night air. "They said I wasn't good enough anymore, that I'd lost it. Maybe they were right, but I realized something that night. Music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest." He began to play the song from the pub, the one he'd written in his darkest moment. But this time, it was different. Stronger, more confident. As he sang, something magical happened. The crowd began to sing along, even though they'd never heard the song before. They felt the words in their bones, understood the pain and the hope and the defiance. They can take away the stage. They can tear out every page, but they can't silence what I feel. They can't make this moment less real. Police arrived, trying to shut down the unauthorized performance, but the crowd wouldn't let them through. They formed a human wall around John, protecting him, believing in him. The performance lasted 3 hours. John played every new song he'd written, told stories between songs, laughed and cried and connected with the audience in a way he hadn't in years. By the time it ended, something had shifted. This wasn't just a concert. It was a movement, a statement, a revolution. The recording from that night spread like wildfire. Bootleg tapes appeared in record shops across London. Within days, radio stations began playing the songs, despite having no official release. Music critics who dismissed John as past his prime were forced to reconsider. But success came with a price. The producer who'd kicked John out of the session filed a lawsuit, claiming John had violated his contract. Major record labels threatened to blacklist him. Former friends in the industry turned their backs, afraid of being associated with someone so unpredictable. John's marriage to Yoko was strained. The constant pressure, the financial uncertainty, the attacks from the press, it was taking its toll. "Maybe they're right," John said one night, sitting in his kitchen, staring at a pile of legal documents. "Maybe I should just apologize, go back to the studio, play by their rules." Yoko looked at him with those intense, knowing eyes. "Is that what you want?" "I don't know what I want anymore." "Yes, you do. You've always known. You're just scared to admit it." She was right. He was scared, terrified, actually, of failing, of being forgotten, of proving everyone who doubted him right. But he was more scared of losing himself, of becoming just another musician who'd sold out, who'd traded authenticity for approval. The next day, John held a press conference. The room was packed with journalists, all expecting him to back down, to apologize, to retreat. Instead, he doubled down. "I'm not sorry for what I did," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I'm not sorry for recording music the way I wanted to record it. And I'm not sorry for believing that art should be about truth, not profit." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "This album is going to be released. Not through a major label, not through traditional channels. We're going to press it ourselves and sell it directly to the people who want to hear it. Because that's who this music is for. Not executives in boardrooms, not critics with agendas, but real people who understand what it means to be kicked down and to get back up." The press conference ended in chaos. Half the journalists were outraged. The other half were inspired. But John had made his choice, and there was no going back. The album, titled Kicked Out, was released on March 15, 1971. It was pressed in a small factory in East London, packaged in simple brown paper with handwritten track listings. No fancy artwork, no marketing campaign, just music. It sold 50,000 copies in the first week, all through word of mouth. By the end of the month, it had sold 200,000 copies. Major labels that had threatened to blacklist John were now desperately trying to sign him. But John refused every offer. He'd proven his point. He didn't need them. The music spoke for itself. Critics called it the most honest album of the decade. Musicians cited it as inspiration for their own work. And most importantly, fans connected with it in a way they hadn't connected with music in years. The song John had written that night in the pub, the one he'd played in the streets of Soho, became an anthem, not just for musicians, but for anyone who'd ever been told they weren't good enough. Anyone who'd been kicked out, shut down, dismissed. "They threw me out into the cold, but I found fire in my soul, And now I'm burning brighter still, because they couldn't break my will. Years later, when asked about that night at Abbey Road, about being kicked out of the session, John would smile that familiar, knowing smile. "Best thing that ever happened to me," he'd say, "because it forced me to remember why I started making music in the first place, not for approval, not for fame, but because I had something to say, and I needed to say it." The producer who kicked him out never worked with another major artist again. The studio where it happened became a tourist attraction, with people coming from around the world to stand in the room where John Lennon was told he wasn't good enough. And John kept making music his way. Sometimes it was successful. Sometimes it wasn't. But it was always honest, always real, always him. Because that's what happens when you get kicked out into the cold. You either freeze, or you find the fire inside yourself that nobody can extinguish. John Lennon found his fire that night, and it burned brighter than anyone could have imagined. The story of John Lennon being kicked out of that recording session reminds us that sometimes our greatest moments come from our darkest hours. That rejection can be redirection, and that the only approval that truly matters is the one you give yourself. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own moments of being knocked down and getting back up, subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments, what's your kicked out moment? When did rejection become your greatest teacher? Because we all have those moments. And we all have a choice. Let them destroy us or let them define us. John Lennon chose to let his moment define him. What will you choose?